Let me tell you the story of the Korean automotive industry. The first attempts to establish an automotive industry began during the Korean War. When the war broke out, the United States brought large amounts of military equipment into South Korea. Because this equipment was used intensively, it required constant repairs and had to be returned to the battlefield as quickly as possible. As a result, a large network of repair workshops emerged across the country. Korean mechanics learned not only how to repair military vehicles, but also how to manufacture simple replacement parts. Since repairing vehicles required dismantling and reassembling them, they eventually began experimenting with building complete cars using American components. This led to the creation of the first Korean automobile, the Seiol. However, production remained largely artisanal because of a lack of capital and industrial equipment. For example, since Korea did not have the necessary stamping presses, workers cut open used American oil drums, flattened the steel, and used it to make body panels. Over time, however, production declined and the company eventually went bankrupt. The situation changed after Park Chung-hee came to power. A passionate supporter of industrialization and a car enthusiast himself, Park was determined to build a domestic automotive industry. One of his first major initiatives was a government program to develop automobile manufacturing. The government's strategy was straightforward. At first, Korean companies would assemble foreign-designed vehicles from imported parts. Gradually, more and more of those components would be produced domestically until the industry became largely self-sufficient. To implement this policy, the government selected a single company and granted it an exclusive license to manufacture automobiles. At the time, South Korea's market was too small and too poor to support multiple manufacturers. The license gave the company access to long-term government loans, foreign currency, and generous tax incentives. Access to foreign currency was particularly important. Under Park Chung-hee's government, virtually all imports were tightly controlled. Companies could not import goods without government approval, making the manufacturing license extremely valuable. The first company to receive such a license was Saenara Motors. The company made a promising start. With financial support from the government, it built its own factory and signed a cooperation agreement with Nissan. Under the agreement, Saenara imported parts from Japan and assembled the Nissan Bluebird in South Korea. Although the business was profitable, the government was dissatisfied with the company's slow progress in localizing parts production. As a result, in 1963, the government revoked Saenara's license. After producing only about 2,700 cars, the company went bankrupt. Because Saenara's assets had been pledged as collateral to a state-owned bank, ownership passed to the bank after the bankruptcy. In 1964, the government granted a new manufacturing license to Shinjin Motors, a company that had previously specialized in repairing American military vehicles. Along with the license, Shinjin also acquired Saenara's factory and assets. Shinjin continued assembling the Nissan Bluebird, and later, in 1966, also began producing Toyota models. However, just like its predecessor, the company failed to localize production quickly enough, and its manufacturing license was eventually revoked. Determined not to repeat the same mistake, the government changed its strategy. Instead of supporting a single manufacturer, it decided to create competition by licensing several companies. Hyundai received a license in 1967, followed by Asia Motors later that year and Kia Motors in 1971. Overall, the 1960s were a relatively successful decade for the Korean automotive industry. Vehicle production increased roughly tenfold, although the total volume remained modest. By 1970, annual production had reached only about 29,000 vehicles. One of the industry's biggest challenges remained the slow pace of localization. The government devoted significant attention to this issue. In 1965, it introduced a 5-year localization plan, and after disappointing results, it replaced it with a new 3-year plan in 1969. Nevertheless, despite strong government involvement, the targets were never fully achieved. Engines were a particularly difficult problem. Korean manufacturers still relied on imported engines, which represented a significant share of each vehicle's cost. To reduce dependence on imports and save valuable foreign currency, the government tried to establish a single domestic engine plant that would supply all manufacturers. However, every attempt to create such a facility ultimately failed. In 1973, as part of a broader strategy to develop South Korea's heavy and chemical industries, President Park announced an ambitious target: annual automobile production of 500,000 vehicles by the early 1980s. To achieve this goal, the government launched the Long-Term Automotive Industry Development Plan. Under the program, each of the 4 licensed manufacturers had to submit a proposal for developing its own affordable passenger car with strong export potential. Companies whose projects were approved received government financing, subsidies, and other forms of support. The first project to receive approval was the Hyundai Pony. At the time, however, Korean engineers lacked the experience needed to develop a modern passenger car entirely on their own. Hyundai therefore hired George Turnbull, a former executive at British Leyland, along with 5 experienced British engineers. Working together with Korean engineers, this international team developed a completely new automobile. The Hyundai Pony entered production in 1975. Just 3 years later, Hyundai had exported around 18,000 vehicles to 42 countries. Without exaggeration, the Pony marked a turning point in the history of the Korean automotive industry. It was the first Korean-designed car to demonstrate that South Korean manufacturers could compete successfully in international markets. By 1977, the government had become so confident in the industry's future that it announced even more ambitious production targets: 1 million vehicles by 1981 and 2 million by 1986. To reach these goals, manufacturers rapidly expanded their production capacity using generous loans provided by state-owned banks. However, another challenge soon emerged. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution disrupted global oil supplies. Since Iran was then the world's second-largest oil exporter, oil prices rose sharply. The resulting economic slowdown caused demand for automobiles to fall worldwide. South Korea produced about 200,000 vehicles in 1979, but over the following 2 years, output nearly halved. The industry entered a severe crisis. Many manufacturers faced bankruptcy because they had borrowed heavily to expand production, only to find that demand had collapsed. To prevent the collapse of this strategically important industry, the government once again intervened by restructuring debt and introducing measures to rationalize production. It is also important to remember that exports had always been the government's primary objective. Although Korean manufacturers gradually increased overseas sales, they faced fierce competition from Japanese automakers, who had entered global markets earlier and already produced reliable, inexpensive vehicles with strong government support. Competing against them was extremely difficult. The situation changed dramatically in the mid-1980s. In 1985, Japan agreed to voluntary export restraints that limited shipments of Japanese automobiles to the United States. Soon afterward, the Plaza Accord caused the Japanese yen to appreciate sharply, making Japanese cars significantly more expensive in international markets. These developments created a major opportunity for Korean manufacturers, particularly in the affordable compact car segment in the United States. During just 3 years of US-Japan trade tensions, South Korean automobile exports increased fourfold, from roughly 150,000 vehicles to nearly 600,000. Total vehicle production climbed to almost 1 million units annually. Although the Korean automotive industry would continue to experience both successes and setbacks, it was during the 1980s that it truly became internationally competitive.